Hello, and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Marketing Podcast, the show where we help you establish your author brand, increase the size of your audience, and sell more books. I'm Lindsay Baroker, and I'm here with Jeffrey Poole and Joe Lalo. All three of us are actually here this week, so lucky you guys. Even more important than our being here is an awesome guest, Megan Crewe. She's recently published a successful standalone YA fantasy novel. So we're going to ask her all about how to do it without series. That's the big thing. But let me go ahead and read your intro there, Megan, before I let you take over. Megan lives in Toronto, Canada with her husband and son, and does on occasion say A. She's always planning some new trip around the world, and she spent the last 6 years studying Kung Fu, so you should probably be nice to her. We should be nice to her. She's been making up stories about magic and spirits and other what-ifs since before she knew how to write words on paper. Her novels have been nominated for multiple awards and published in more than 10 different languages. They include the paranormal Give Up the Ghost, post-apocalyptic The Fallen World series, the sci-fi Earth and Sky trilogy, and the book we're going to talk about today, we might touch on other books too, but contemporary fantasy, A Mortal Song. Hi, Megan. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Looks like you got your start with traditional publishing. Do you want to tell us a bit about your journey and everything, how things went?
It was basically when I was really getting started. I started trying to get published when I was a teenager, and self-publishing wasn't even really a thing then. And I got my first agent in around the mid-2000s. So again, that was how you became an author, was you went out and you found an agent, or you went directly to publishing houses if you felt you could do that. And then you hopefully got your book published by a publisher. And at that time, self-publishing was kind of those are those people who sell their books out of the back of their van or something, that kind of thing. And they're like, my first book, which came out in 2009, they didn't even do an ebook version until the following year, because ebooks were still so little on kind of publishing radar at that time. So it was really, that was the way that you did things. And I think it was good for me because I write YA, and it is fairly difficult, I think, to get a really good audience with self-publishing YA, especially when you're an unknown and you're just starting out, just because a lot of the teens, they don't have e-readers, and they're reading print books like from their school library or from the public library. A lot of my traditional publishing sales have been to the school and library market rather than directly to consumers. So I really like that I could reach the actual teenage audience. I think there's a statistic that goes around, I don't know where it comes from, so I don't know how accurate it is, that something like 80% of the people who read self-published YA are adults, which is fine, and I'm very happy to have adults reading my books too. But it's very nice to reach the actual teenagers,
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like when you're younger, at least I've heard this theory, and I think it's true, that it's cool to have things, like that you own things, or you're still living at home. So paperback books are still desirable.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard that stat too, that a lot of teen readers still aren't really that into the ebooks.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much it's wanting to have the physical books and how much it's not having the devices. And I guess pretty much all teenagers have cell phones these days, but I have never tried to read a book on a cell phone. I don't know. It doesn't seem like that would be very enjoyable. I use my iPad for that. So yeah, but I would imagine that's probably going to change though. As just the technology becomes more and more prevalent.
Yeah, I've definitely read parts of books on my phone. Kind of, it's the emergency, I'm in line somewhere or stuck somewhere waiting, and I don't enjoy it that much, but I have heard that people are doing it, especially in other countries where they're kind of, they've got cell phones, but don't necessarily have the e-reader devices. It hasn't really been big in a lot of other countries. But could you tell us, what took you from, how'd your first launch go, your first traditionally published book, and how did you end up going into self-publishing?
Well, the launch went kind of probably a very sort of typical journey. It wasn't like a super big deal or anything. It was kind of a solidly mid-list title where I was with one of the so-called Big Five publishers. My first book was with Henry Holt originally. And They did kind of the standard stuff. They sent out the advanced copies to reviewers, and I got some nice reviews in the review journals, and they were pitching it at conferences and stuff, which is sort of the standard stuff. And, and it sold decently well, and I was quite happy with that. And it was, I could find it in the store, which is always kind of a big deal. And then, I've continued with that for the next several books. But what brought me to self-publishing was really that I found myself in this period between having traditionally published books out. I finished my most recent trilogy last year, and then I don't currently have any books under contract at the moment. And I'd already kind of started dipping my toes into self-publishing. A couple of years ago, I put out a sort of novella collection that is follow-up stories to one of my traditionally published series. And then I re-released my first novel, the Henry Holt one. I got the rights back because it had gone out of print, and then I've re-released that on my own. And I've also done a little bit of kind of exploring the whole pen name thing, trying to launch some adult stuff that way. So I felt like I had a pretty good grounding at that point in the basics of, how do you get word out, and what are the good strategies for getting visibility for a book and all that kind of stuff. And I had this book that, Immortal Song, I actually started writing all the way back in 2009, shortly after my first book was published, the first traditionally published one. And it kind of was one of these things where I write really fast and I write a lot of stuff. And so I had this book, but there was always something else that my agent felt would be a better fit for the current market in traditional publishing. So it never really went on submission. Like, a couple of editors ended up seeing it who I was already working with, but we kind of kept putting it on hold and putting it on hold. And I was like, well, I know I'm not going to have any traditionally published books in 2016. I'd really like to continue the sort of career momentum that I've built up. I feel comfortable trying to self-publish something, so why not take this book and put it out there and see how well I can do with it. And it was also, the book is set in Japan, and I've done a lot of research. I've gone to Japan. I really wanted to keep it as authentic as I could possibly make it. And I was a little worried that if it kind of went the traditional publishing route, of the possibility of that I might be asked to make changes to make it a little more American friendly, and then not be as true to the culture. And then you have to worry about things like the cover getting whitewashed, which has happened quite a bit with traditionally published books. And this way, I got to pick the cover artist and tell him what I wanted. I got to decide what I was going to listen to from the editor and not have to worry about, being pressured if something didn't sit right with me. I worked with a line editor and copy editor who's lived in Japan for several years, and she was able to, help me with some of the details that I might have been a little shaky on. So having control over all of that was really great.
Yeah, those sound like some great reasons to just go ahead and self-publish it on your own, for sure. The control is awesome especially if you're worried that they're not going to handle it the way that you're hoping. We actually haven't had anybody on, I don't think yet, that's done kind of Asian-inspired fantasy. It seems like a fairly small niche. There is a category, I know a couple categories on Amazon that you can, like, under myths and folklore or something like that. What are your thoughts on, like, for other people that may be doing it? Is it kind of harder because it is a smaller niche, or maybe are there more opportunities because it's not too competitive yet?
I'm not really sure because I don't have anything to directly compare it to, in terms of, it's not like I have a different standalone YA self-published book that I can go, oh, that one did better or worse. For me, it was really just that was what fit the story that I wanted to tell the best. And I was already somewhat familiar with Japanese culture and the kind of the tropes of their storytelling from watching Japanese movies and anime and reading books by Japanese authors. So I felt a certain, I knew there was a lot that I still needed to research, but I felt a certain comfort level there that I think if you're going to write outside your culture like that, it's important that you're picking a culture where you already do feel somewhat comfortable, and you feel like, yes, the blanks that are there, I know what to do so that I can fill them in, and I know that I'm willing to take the steps necessary to make sure that I'm doing the culture justice, and I'm not going to like write something that ends up being hurtful. In terms of the marketing side of things, I mean, I guess it was probably a little easier to get the little orange bestseller tag on the book because it's in one of those categories, and then there isn't quite as much competition there as if it was only in like YA urban fantasy, which you have to basically break like the top 100 to be at the top of that category. But yeah, I'm not totally sure whether like the kind of trade-off of there's fewer books in this category, but maybe then fewer people are looking at that category, how that balances out for sure.
Yeah, I was a bestseller for quite a while in the steampunk category, which probably has even fewer books in it than Asian myths and folklore, whatever it is. Yeah, I found in my case that it was nice if you could get some eyeballs by being at the top of that category, but if your story actually could go out and also appeal to like the swords and sorcery, or in your case, maybe the contemporary urban fantasy people, then that was sort of the best of both worlds. You could be in a top 100, but also, maybe being found by some of those other readers. And it seems like, I've only read your blurb, but it definitely seems like something that could appeal to fantasy fans in general.
Yeah, I was definitely aiming for that. And I recognize it's a little bit of an odd duck in terms of how to market it, because technically it's contemporary fantasy. It takes place in the modern day. The characters spend some time in Tokyo. But I think the feel of it is a little more on the high fantasy side, the sword and sorcery kind of, sword battles and magic and those sorts of things. So it's been a little tricky figuring out how to market it that way, because it's definitely not the traditional kind of gritty urban fantasy that a lot of the sort of trendy urban fantasy is. But I didn't want people to like pick it up expecting it to be high fantasy and then be like, why are there cars and computers? So, but it seemed like, I mean, based on the feedback that I've been getting from the readers who read it, and I've been lucky enough to get a lot of people have left reviews, it seems like people are enjoying that kind of mishmash.
All right. Well, you've definitely done well especially considering I was going to ask you, you're all in sci-fi and fantasy, but you seem to jump around quite a bit with the post-apocalyptic and the sci-fi. And is this your first kind of contemporary urban fantasy type?
Well, I mean, my first book, the speculative element is ghosts. So, I mean, technically it's a paranormal, but it's not like a paranormal romance paranormal. It's more like, here's the real world with fantastical elements. So I mean, that is kind of in that area. And then I've written other books that were more fantasy, including high fantasy and urban fantasy, that just either they ended up being shelved or whatever. My very first book that I wrote when I was in 9th grade was basically a ripoff of all of the high fantasy books I'd read, plus most heavily the I can't remember, the Deathgate cycle, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, which I was so into then, and I like totally ripped off entire scenes from as you do when you're 13. Yeah, so that was I did actually start probably a little more in fantasy and then sort of veered off into sci-fi, and I just like anything where I can explore stuff that's kind of beyond the bounds of our reality.
All right, I won't admit to my Forgotten Realms fan fiction that I read as a teenager. So I guess that'll be it for my introductory questions, and I'll let the guys talk a little bit here, and then we're going to ask you kind of what you did for marketing in the launch.
Sure.
All right, yeah. So my first question is, a lot of time ideas for a story will be floating around your head for a really long time, or in assorted notebooks and text documents. You said that Immortal Song, you started writing it back in 2009, but like, how long ago did the idea come to you?
That one is actually one where I started writing it fairly soon after I got the idea. I mean, I have other books where I have one where it like took 10 years before I managed to get to the point where I could write a complete draft. So the short end for me is like, I think I got the idea in like the spring of 2009, and then I wrote the first draft toward the end of 2009, because it just ended up coming together fairly quickly.
What sort of inspired it to, like, just a general interest in the culture?
Well, it actually didn't start specifically with the culture. The starting point of the idea was really, and a lot of this is very similar for a lot of my ideas. A lot of the time I get inspired by other books and wanting to kind of fill in the parts that I think are missing in stories that I would find interesting, or a different spin on something. And I had just read 2 YA novels back to back that had the sort of the trope of, the main character thinks she's ordinary, but then discovers, oh, wow, I have this super magical heritage and I'm super powerful. And now I'm going to have a lot of angst about how difficult that is. And I was like, well, like, but what about, and at least one of them was specifically a changeling scenario where there was somebody else who thought that they were super special, but actually they weren't. They were just there to kind of swap places so that the other one could be hidden away with the humans. And I couldn't help thinking, like, well, what would it be like if it was the opposite situation? Like, you think that you're this magical or supernatural being and that you have this special destiny. And then it's like, nope, sorry, that's not actually you. You can go off and live an ordinary human life and somebody else will come along and do all the exciting stuff. And just there was so much dramatic possibility in that. And the way that it ended up coming to the Japanese culture was just, I needed a mythology where I could see it making sense that this sort of swap might happen, and certain events that I wanted to happen in the plot. And the stuff that I had seen from Japanese mythology just ended up meshing really well.
Cool. It's funny because it's like people often talk about, like, where do you get your inspiration? And I've many times said you should read and watch things that aren't necessarily good, because, like, obviously watching and reading the good stuff is going to, fill your brain with all the nutrition necessary to create good things. But exposing yourself to stuff that maybe they didn't put a lot of effort into shows you all the little gaps you could fill in with much better stuff. And they didn't do that, so you can.
Definitely.
Okay, so since quite a lot of people are familiar with Western fantasy, writers within that genre can take shortcuts and draw on the cultural knowledge of the subject and setting. Is it more challenging to tell a story in a version of the genre with different cultural roots?
Yeah, I think it definitely was probably one of the biggest issues that I had. This book went through a lot of drafts, sending it to critique partners and with my agent. And one of the biggest concerns that people raised were either I was over-explaining things or I wasn't explaining other things enough. And it's difficult when, after you've done a certain amount of research and you feel like you're well-versed in everything that's going on, and you're writing from the point of view of a character who understands everything that's going on, to then be able to step back and go, well, what do I need to make sure that the readers understand, and what can they actually fill in the blanks with? And that was definitely one of the trickiest things. And I think that was one of the areas where I really thought about, well, how do they do it in high fantasy? Because in high fantasy, even if it's kind of the typical medieval sort of world, usually you do still have to kind of explain, well, exactly how does the political system work in this particular version, and what resources do they have, and, where is the protagonist's position in society, and all that kind of stuff. So I looked to those books more than the urban fantasy to figure out, well, how can I integrate that information without it coming across as, info dumpy or unnatural?
Yeah, that's a difficult puzzle to solve sometimes, because, again, like, you come down to some very tropey choices. You can either do the info dump, or you can have the non-knowledgeable everyman character as an audience insert. And, like, if you're doing either of those, obviously, can be considered a no-no, but not doing either of those, you end up getting into that situation where, wow, this person's going a long way to avoid doing that specific thing. It's amazing. It's amazing how tricky that can get.
Mm.
All right, just one more quick question before I hand you off to Jeff. Your bio mentions that you've been translated into 10 languages. I assume this is the traditionally published stuff.
Yes.
Do you have any sort of experience with, like, have you found that being translated had was useful or effective for your authorly career?
Well, I mean, basically it's free money. They pay advances and you get extra money, and then that means more time you can spend writing rather than trying to make money in other ways. And it is also really cool I've ended up getting fan mail from readers in all different countries. And that's been really cool, just knowing that I've sort of extended my readership to all these people who wouldn't have been able to read the books in English. I even got to chat with the woman who did the German translation of my first book, then also ended up with a different publisher doing the translation for my next series, and emailed me, and we were chatting back and forth. And it's just the connections that you make are really neat.
Yeah, yeah. I had a similar experience with getting some email from people who read the translated edition, and I had to translate the email because they didn't know my language. And also, by the way, one of my favorite things with that is then you get to ask the reader, like, basically it's a confirmation that the translation was a good translation, because as a non-native speaker, you don't get to know how well they did. So it's nice to know that you at least earn some fans on the translated version too.
Yeah.
And I guess I should ask, like, it's been said that there are 5 languages that you can get that sort of get you into the entire Western world, and it's English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. I'm kind of stretching my brain to see what the other 5 languages would be to fill out the 10,
Well, I actually have not done French yet.
Really?
So I have to have at least 6 of it. So let's see. We did Germany, Brazil, so that was Portuguese, Spain, and we did do Italy. I think Italy was just the first book for the one series. My first book got published in Romania. Then there was Czech Republic and Slovakia and Taiwan. And I think we also did China. I think we got China and Taiwan separately. I don't know if that was all of them there. Oh, and Australia, although that was English.
Well, yeah, English is in the list. And see, that's useful to know. And it's like, if I was going to try to assemble a list, Portuguese should be on it because it's a huge market thanks to South America. But I would not have guessed some of those others. And it's one of the languages that I was translated into was Bulgarian, and I wouldn't have put that on the list either. But apparently there was enough of an audience. So yeah, it's cool.
I mean, you never know who the book is going to appeal to. I mean, the main book that I have sold to different territories is my first trilogy, the Fallen World series, and that's the one that's going to like 10 different places. But then the first book was Germany and Romania, and that's it. Like, I don't know, like Romania. And they didn't take any of my other books. They just really liked that book. And then my most recent trilogy has sold to one place, which was, I think that one was Brazil. It's only in Brazil. Brazil is a big one.
It's a huge country, and it's why a lot of people mention when you're selling the language rights, selling the Portuguese rights, make sure it's not worldwide, because if there's a small publisher in Portugal who wants worldwide rights for your stuff, they can sell in Brazil and basically lowball you on the price. I should just ask one more thing. Now that you've got a self-published book, do you think you're going to try or pursue a translation for that?
Oh, definitely. My agent is already looking into that for me. Thankfully, he's got a very strong foreign rights department. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed.
Yet another good reason to have an agent, even if you're self-publishing something.
Oh, yes.
All right. Well, that's it. That's all I have for this section. So I'm going to hand you off to Jeff for a little more.
Alrighty, I've got a couple questions regarding your writing style there. Are you an outliner, or you prefer to freestyle it?
It's interesting that I found that my approach has kind of gradually evolved in the last several years. I've generally been a very, very strict outliner. And that's partially because when I was first writing those novels when I was a teenager, I kept trying to write them without outlining, and then I would write as many as like 100 pages, and then I would stall, and I'd be like, I don't know where I'm going with this story, and I don't like it anymore, and I'm going to stop now. So I learned that I had to outline the book to make sure that I actually knew where I was going. And I do still, I always I always know the beginning and all the key events in the middle, and then where I'm going, where the ending is going to be. And with the books that have turned into trilogies, before I even wrote the first book, I had a decent idea of at least where each of the books would begin and end across the entire trilogy, just so I could kind of keep that whole framework in mind. And I used to also very strictly outline like scene by scene, and I would have the entire book written out in point form notes before I actually started writing. But I started finding that I often ended up then going in kind of the wrong direction, and I would be writing along and I'd just be like, push through it, because I always hate my rough drafts inevitably. And so it was kind of hard to notice whether it was just, I just don't like this because it's a rough draft, or I just don't like it because it's actually not going in the right direction. And then I would have to go back and like rewrite from scratch and re-outline stuff because something that made sense in the outline didn't actually make sense in the prose. So now I'm kind of doing sort of halfway between, I'll like outline in detail the first few scenes, and I'll have chunks throughout in a basic idea, like 1 or 2 notes for each chapter. And then before I get to the next chapter, I'll go and outline that chapter thoroughly with the knowledge of what I just wrote before. And I'm finding that kind of in between, you know, not knowing everything that's going to happen next allows a little more flexibility, and I can make sure that when I'm writing next fits what has actually happened once I've actually written the story in prose much better, and makes for somewhat fewer revisions. In the second draft, I still do a lot of rewriting, but not quite as much as before.
Yeah, you got to be the first interviewee that we've asked that hasn't. As usually, most of them will say, "Yeah, it's a strict outliner." Of course, a few of us said, "You know, we'll freestyle it. You know, I'll just write what flows." I have yet to hear of someone that says, "Kind of a mix of both." So that's interesting. You also mentioned you are a fast writer. Do you set writing goals for yourself each day?
Sort of. I mean, I used to have pretty set writing goals of like, if I was home for half the day, then I would try and get 1 chapter done. And if I was home for the whole day, then I would try and get 1 chapter in the morning, 1 chapter in the afternoon, which usually was 2,000 to 3,000 words approximately each session. And because I used to work in the afternoons, day job. And now I'm technically writing full time, but I'm also a mom now. And so there's kind of all other sorts of responsibilities to juggle. So I've cut back a little bit on the kind of the pressures on myself, because I found like I have to go a little easier on myself, but I do still try and write at least 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. And if I can get in more, then that's great. And I also get a lot of writing, and I try and do at least one writing retreat per year where I have at least a few days with nothing to do except for write, and then I'm probably doing at least 5,000 to 6,000 a day, which gets a good chunk of a book done, you know.
I hear that. Have you ever had any writer's block? And if so, what have you done to overcome it?
I sort of feel like, I don't know, I don't want to say that writer's block is a myth, but I feel like usually writer's block either means that you're trying to force something that isn't really the right thing for the story, or you just need to think things through a little more, and you're not giving yourself the space to do that. So if I'm I'm like, I don't know how to get this scene to work, or I don't know what needs to happen in the next scene. And if I just go and like relax for a little bit and kind of let the story play out in my head like a movie, or I'll go out for a walk and I find that walking kind of jogs the creative juices, then pretty much always I get it figured out fairly quickly. I've never had a time when it was like I couldn't work on a book for days on end because I was stuck. But I guess everyone sort of has to find their own techniques for getting out of that place, and presumably there are some people who maybe it's not as easy to get unstuck.
I was about ready to say, had you called it a myth, about ready to say myth busted. Been there, done that. But all right. What is the most difficult task you faced when you switched from traditional indie publishing? I mean, if you could go back in time and take another crack at releasing Immortal Song, is there anything you'd do differently?
You know, that's kind of hard to say, because I feel like I did pretty much everything that I could, And I'm not 100% sure that there's anything, like there are things I can think of, well, maybe I could have tried differently, but I don't know how much of a difference they would have made, or maybe they would have made a difference in the negative side of things. For example, I wasn't entirely happy with, I had a pre-order period that was about 5 weeks, and I would probably have preferred to do a shorter one and have more of the sales be kind of more condensed, to keep the ranking higher rather than spread out over the longer period. But on the flip side, most of my existing readers are used to the traditional publishing schedule, where they hear about a book like 6 months before it comes out, and they see the cover and everything, and it's up for pre-order already. And I was a little concerned that if I just sprung a book on them and was like, here's this book and it's going to be out in a week, that it would take a little while for that to kind of sink in, and then they wouldn't, maybe get around to buying it until like a month later anyway. So I'm not totally sure if I was going to release another book self-published, which there's a fairly high chance that I will. I might experiment with having a shorter pre-order period now that they're kind of like, oh, this is the thing that Megan does. And they're a little more primed for that now. And I guess the only other thing is that I kind of wish that I had gotten my advance copies. I did print advance copies so that I could send them to some of the professional review places. And there was at least one that I wasn't able to send anything to because they required 3 months lead time, and I didn't have the advance copies until 2 months ahead of time. So out of luck. But yeah, I mean, those are fairly little things. I feel like I planned the heck out of that release. So
good deal. Yeah, most people used to say like, oh, I wish I would have actually spent the money on a better cover. Oh, I wish I would have done this or that. But good deal. All right, let me hand you back over to Lindsay. We can start up the marketing questions for you.
Cool.
All right, definitely. This is the part everybody enjoys listening to. Not that they didn't like the first part, but everybody wants to figure out how to sell more books.
Okay.
All right. So I actually first came across you because of your post on K-boards, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You actually kind of did like all the sites that you bought sponsorships with and kind of talked about how it was going. But one of the things you mentioned in your post was sort of like you knew this was going to be a little tough because you're not doing a series, you're doing a standalone. So how did that kind of affect your launch and marketing plans?
Well, I think that the main way that it affected it is that I think standard advice with a self-published book is usually not to put too big a push behind the first book, because you don't want to kind of go all in, because there's a lot of readers who want to wait until they see that more of the books in the series are out, and you kind of like, you do sort of a small push, and then you do a little bit of a bigger push for book 2, and then you do a really big push for the first book when book 3 is out. And just sort of build momentum across the series. But since I was not going to have a book 2, it was like, okay, I have to go all in on this book, and I only have one chance to get, eyeballs on it while it's in that new release time zone. So I really didn't want to hold back. I wanted to give it the best chance possible. And I think that's probably the biggest difference there.
Okay, and could you kind of outline basically what your launch strategy was?
It was mostly just trying to keep consistent sales like across the pre-order period. I wasn't sure how much I could expect to get on any given day, but I was hoping to continuously have new pre-orders coming in so that the rank never dropped too low, and sort of set a kind of a standard. Everyone always talks about the Amazon algorithms and how you kind of set a standard for where your book should be, which I was like, well, I try and do that. I don't know how well that works in the pre-order period. So the big thing that I did during the pre-order period was, other than, I had tweets going out, and I had mailed my mailing list at the beginning of the period. But I also did a whole bunch of mailing list swaps with other authors who write YA fantasy and that sort of thing. And that definitely helps. Just periodically, every day or two, there'd be somebody new mailing their list, and then that would bring in at least a handful of pre-orders. So that helped keep the momentum going a lot. And then just for the first week, and for the pre-order period in the first week, I kept the book at 99 cents, just to make it extra appealing. And I basically booked all of the promo sites that I could get. The only one that I really wanted that I couldn't get was Robin Reed's, which unfortunately I kind of hedged my bets and was like, well, maybe I can get the big featured spot that's for any genre, which they book a little later, but I had to wait until I had some reviews up. And then they declined me for that. And at that point, the actual fantasy category was already all booked up for my entire first week. So I couldn't get in there. But everywhere else that I had good experiences with before I got in there, and tried to spread them out across the first week of release while it was on sale to, again, sort of try and get more steady sales rather than, a big burst all in one day and then have it taper off immediately. So that was the theory, and it seemed to work reasonably well.
Yeah, that's great. Did you have any second doubts about launching at 99 cents, knowing that, this was the only book that was going to be, there weren't going to be other books for people to go on and buy at $5 or whatever?
I thought about it a little, but I think that any downside in terms of that pricing were totally offset by the amount of additional promo that I was able to do at that price. I mean, there aren't really any promo sites that will promote a $3.99 book. So, I would have been making more per book in the first week, but I have no doubt that I would have been selling a lot fewer copies and probably would have made less money overall. And then also it would have dropped from the rankings a lot faster. So I think that was, to me, it was worth it. But I would do it again. That's like, I already know that if I was releasing even another standalone book, that I would do the first week at 99 cents again, or at very least the first few days.
Yeah, I would do the same thing. So I'm not second guessing.
Okay.
I was just wondering if, I always think you're always the first in the series, but I was wondering if your thinking was any different as a standalone novel. But let me ask you about these mailing list swaps, because I think people are going to wonder, like, how do I get other authors to promote my stuff? Were these people you've kind of known for a while, or how did you go about approaching people?
It was mostly through, like, I'm in a few different Facebook groups for writers, with a lot of other self-published writers, and I've done a fair amount of building of my own mailing list in the last year because I knew I was gearing up for this release, and I knew that a mailing list seems to be pretty key in a lot of people's strategies. So by the time that I was starting to look into, promoting the pre-order and that sort of thing, I had over 10,000 people on my list. And if you have a fairly large list and then you say, you go into like a cross promo Facebook group or whatever, and you're like, hey, this is my book that's coming out that I would like people to promote, and I'd like people in the same genre, and this is how big my list is, and I will mention your book if you mention mine. You can usually get a fair number of people who have decent sized lists who are happy to do the exchange because they want to get the word out about their books too. So it's really just about kind of finding those groups where people are looking for that sort of thing. And, I'm sure that I had made some connections chatting with people about craft stuff and business stuff in some of the groups before too, and that helped also. But I don't think that it's something where people have to feel like, oh, I have to do all this complicated networking and establish relationships for dozens of years or something. There's definitely groups where you can kind of just go in and say, hey, this is what I can offer you. Do you want to do a trade? And a lot of people will go for that.
Yeah, that's actually, I can totally see that working. I think a lot of people will ask without having that, like, here's my huge list that I can promote your stuff to in return, or here's something I can do for you in return. Did you have any concerns about, like, you might get stuck in a situation where you're promoting somebody's book that you haven't read, or that it might not be very good, or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I knew that I wasn't going to, like, say to my mailing list that I had read a book that I hadn't. And I basically just presented, here are these books, and, they're on sale, or they're a special pre-order price, or right now it's free, or for some people I was mentioning that there was a giveaway. And I figured that, my readers, they're interested in books in general, and they can go and check it out, and then they can decide whether it sounds like something that they would be interested in. I think the one thing that I would be a little more careful with the next time around is that I was open to doing exchanges with people who wrote adult urban fantasy as long as they felt that their readers would be potentially interested in my book having a teenage protagonist. And I tried to make it clear that their book that I promoted needed to be appropriate for a teen audience because I have a lot of teen readers who are on my mailing list. But I still ended up getting a few people where we kind of scrambled at the last minute where they sent me their book that they wanted me to share. And I was like, this doesn't look like I can necessarily actually share this without people potentially getting mad at me. And we had to figure out an alternate arrangement. So yeah, so it's the one thing that I definitely need to be careful with next time.
Were there naked dragons on the front? Were they those
well, I think naked dragons would actually be okay. I mean, dragons don't really wear clothes, but it kind of the where you're reading the description, you're like, this sounds like this is kind of 18 plus material.
Naked dragons that become naked humans. Okay,
yes,
got it.
Yes.
All right, so I think also people are going to be curious. 10,000 people is not an insubstantial mailing list. And I know a lot of times with traditional publishing, if you read the end of the book, they're plugging their mailing list, like for the house or their line. So can you tell us how you went about building that up?
Mostly it's been, I had, I think, around 500 people from my own efforts doing promotional stuff through the traditionally published books. And then what I've started doing is just doing giveaways where the main way that you enter is to give your email address. And it says on the giveaway, that they'll also get emails from me. And then I get to put those emails into my mailing list and be like, hey, hello, this is who I am and these are my books. And I've particularly really focused on giving away books that I felt were comparable to my own. They're not obviously exactly the same, but YA fantasy that had kind of a similar sensibility so that I knew that the people who'd want to win those books would potentially also be interested in Immortal Song. And I also made sure to, show people how valued they were joining my mailing list and how much I appreciated them hopefully sticking around by I've been offering one of my other books for free when I add them on, and I'm like, hey, this is the person who won the giveaway, but all of you are welcome to download this book of mine for free. And so they're immediately getting, something from me as a thank you. And I think that has helped a lot with people being happy to stay engaged because they know that I'm planning on offering them at least as much as I'm asking from them. Like, I'm not going to just go buy this, buy this, buy this. I want them to be getting enjoyable stuff out of the experience of hearing from me too.
All right, cool. And I know a lot of people will use like Insta Freebie and some of these sites to build the mailing list by giving away a free book. When you had a standalone book coming, did you, like a lot of people will do a prequel novella or something like that? What did you give away for free that you thought would like kind of entice them to go ahead and buy this when you released it?
Well, with the mailing list, I didn't have a direct connection between the two things. I just used my debut novel that is re-released because that's the only other full-length novel that I'm allowed to give away. But I did do a pre-order campaign where I let people know that if they ordered the book ahead of time and then emailed me their receipt, that they would be able to get, I put together this PDF booklet that had all kinds of photos from my trips to Japan and then details about the story as related to the setting and cultural stuff that I learned while I was there, as well as a 25-page short story that's one of the key sequences in the book from a different character's point of view. So you find out what's going on in his head during all this stuff and some of the stuff that like the main character's unconscious for. And I think that definitely helped. I think the final numbers were that something like a full quarter of the people who pre-ordered the book also asked for the pre-order deal. So they were probably, some of them might have found it a bit afterwards, but I think a lot of them were people who were like, oh, I should order this now so I can get this cool stuff instead of waiting until it's actually out.
All right, sounds like a good strategy, and it's good for people to know you don't necessarily have to give away a book or a box set, or I feel like someone was like, the more things we can give away, the better. But if you have a huge library, maybe that's fine. But if you're starting out or doing a standalone, it doesn't have to be something giant. So in your Kboards post, you kind of mentioned that you had, I think, about 50 early reviews that that you'd kind of prepared. You already talked about maybe doing, I think you did a paperback arc.
Yeah.
What was your strategy, including that, to kind of get a whole bunch of reviews right away that first week or so?
Well, I actually started getting reviews before the first week. I did the little trick where you put the CreateSpace paperback up and then very quickly unapprove it, but then it's still up on Amazon as if it's an active book. And if you link it to the ebook, then people can start leaving reviews right away. So people were already leaving reviews who had read an early copy of the book during the pre-order period. And most of those people I actually got, again, through my mailing list, which has turned out to be a very good tool. Some of the people, back when I first announced the book just to them, I didn't announce it publicly until a month before it came out when I started the pre-order. But I told my existing mailing list, which was around 3,000 people at the time, that I had a new book coming out 2 months before that. I was like, this is top secret news for your eyes only. And I showed them the cover and the blurb and talked up a little bit about why I'd written it. And then I let them know that if they wanted to read it early, that I was happy to send a copy to anyone who had an Amazon account and would be open to reviewing it after they read it. And I got, I think, around 120 requests that way. And close to half of those people did end up reviewing it. Not all of them reviewed it right away, but I think the majority of the reviews that I have right now are from those people. They were awesome.
Yeah, that's a great strategy to get the early reviews, because I noticed, you had quite a list on the Kboards post. Again, I'll link to that in the show notes if anybody wants to go back and read that. This will be episode 105 for anybody looking for it later. But did you need some of the reviews in advance to book those ad slots? Or, I've found that more and more some of the places are allowing new releases, but there are still some that, want to see at least 10 or 20 reviews before they will book a book.
I'm not totally sure. Most of the places, I think I booked when I had somewhere between 10 and 20 reviews up, just because I figured I might as well wait until I had a few up, just so that I had that kind of verification that this is not a total crap book. But like, there were a couple where I actually booked them before the book was even on Amazon. And I just emailed, it was Book Barbarian and then also Book Gorilla. They tend to book up more than a month in advance. And so I emailed them and I was like, I have this book that's going to come out, but I'm not listing it for pre-order until a month ahead of time. And I'm worried that all your spots will be booked up. Can I kind of get in there early? And they both have in their criteria a thing about that they can look at your past books. And if your past books have good reviews, then they'll be a little more flexible about new releases and stuff. So that's one area where it was really helpful to have my traditionally published books to point to, because between the 7 of them that were already out, I probably had close to 300 reviews across all of them. So I'm an established presence to some extent as an author, and that helped a lot, I think, with, saying like, I know how to write a book. This is going to be at least decent quality. You don't have to worry about, including this in your promo.
All right, cool. Yeah, I'm sure you could just point to the Taiwanese book and look, they're saying awesome things. 5 stars, I promise. It's good. No, but thanks for answering my questions. I'm going to pass it to the guys to ask a few more.
Okay.
Yep. My first question is one that it's common for me, but I want to talk a little bit about your covers.
Sure.
Your books do a fantastic job of branding, like the series that you have do this excellent job at branding with their covers. Obviously those are the traditional ones, but how much influence did you have on the covers for those books?
Not a whole lot. I know a few people who've gotten to kind of do a lot of back and forth in the cover design process with traditional publishers, but I think typically, as with my experience, they kind of are like, here's your cover, what do you think? And maybe you can ask for a couple of little tweaks, but you can't be like, I think you should make it totally different. Thankfully, I've liked all of my covers so far. And I've just had like little things like the original cover for The Way We Fall. They had my name in a different spot on the cover that I thought was distracting. And for some reason it was in white, even though the entire rest of the cover was in yellow and black. So that looked kind of weird. And I was like, can you maybe make it that yellow too and put it somewhere else? And then they did. So that was nice of them. And the Earth and Sky, I got to do a few back and forths over like which font we were going to use. And I think a little bit about like the exact imagery under that has like a big thing of the Earth on it for anyone who checks it out. But then there's like a cityscape at the bottom, and we had some debate over what was going to be the silhouette landscape on the bottom. And my editor sent me a few options, and I was like, I like this one best, but maybe some of that element. And so I did get a little involved with that, but the basic style of how they were going to handle it, they'd already figured out.
And for the self-published book, like, how did you pick out and have your cover made?
With that one, I had originally been thinking that maybe I would try and do photographic, but I started looking into the stock photography sites because I do some cover design myself, and I had done the covers for all of my other self-published books. And I knew that I probably wanted something that was a little beyond my abilities with this one, but I was still like, well, maybe I can kind of make a mock-up to show what I'm thinking of. And I very quickly realized that there are hardly any stock images of young Japanese women who, most of them are holding cell phones or something, and I wanted a sword. So I was like, well, I don't know if a photographic cover is going to work. There's like 2 girls on all the stock photography sites who could potentially work, and they're probably already on like 15 other covers. So then I started thinking illustrated, and the big thing for me with that was just I wanted somebody who did really nice just figures, because I knew I wanted the girl to be prominent on the cover, and who could also do their own typography, because I was really nervous about like getting an illustration done and then realizing that it did not work with trying to put typography on it, which I think is a common problem that people end up. They get these beautiful illustrations, but then it's too busy to really work the title in. And I actually asked on the keyboards, I asked if anyone could recommend people who did fantasy illustrated covers with the typography, and somebody recommended, I may pronounce his name wrong, Carlos Quevedo, who did C.N. Crawford's covers for, I don't know what the name of the entire series is, but there's like The Witch's Feast and Witches of the Deep. And I was like, those are really nice covers. And then I looked at his portfolio and was totally blown away. And and I thought he was going to be completely out of my price range, but he was actually like at the kind of around where I expected that I was probably going to pay. So I was like, yes, okay, let's do this.
Excellent. Yeah, it's unfortunate when you when you write a unique book and then you try to find stock stuff for it and you realize, if it's unique, there might be one, and if there's one, then yeah. So yeah, I could see that being a problem. I always prefer illustration, although I understand it's not always appropriate for certain genres. All right, so in your bio, it's also mentioned that you were nominated for a number of awards. Is that the sort of like? I find that traditionally published books more frequently come up for awards. Is that the sort of thing that traditional publishers sort of submit you for, or do you pursue them?
That's something where there's kind of like a standard set of awards that the publishers will send your books out to, and then the ones that I've been nominated for have been mostly Canadian ones, and so in those cases it was mostly my US publishers would have like a Canadian distributor / publicity place, and then they would know which Canadian ones to send it to. So yeah, so mostly I hadn't even needed to think about that. And that's kind of one of the interesting things doing self-publishing, is that now I have my list of like all of the ones that I'm actually allowed to submit to, and I'm like, well, might as well send this one out too. You never know.
Yeah, I was curious to see if you were going to go after them for self-published. Do you feel like having even a nomination is useful for a book, like it generates buzz and gives cred?
Oh, definitely. It probably depends somewhat on what exactly the award is, but for example, my first book in my first trilogy, The Way We Fall, was nominated for this really big award that is run by the Library Association for my province, and it has this whole like book club program across all the schools in the country, where at each grade level the kids will all join book clubs at their school, and they'll read all of the books, and then they vote on which one wins. So it's ultimately a Reader's Choice book award in terms of who actually wins. And I ended up doing a whole bunch of school visits where I got to talk to kids who were reading the book. And I know that there were a lot of Canadian sales just because the libraries were buying it. And that was really, I think that was probably the best thing that has happened in my career. I mean, I think it's because of that there was one time I was doing a signing in a bookstore, and I tend to go around with my bookmarks, and I'm like, hey, do you want a bookmark? I'm signing my book here today. And I went up to this small group of teenagers and did my little spiel, and one of the girls was like, you're Megan Crewe, I love your book. And I was like, you know who I am. And that had literally never happened before. And I'm sure that it's because, you know, the book was getting talked up in the schools. So that was so cool.
Yeah, it's an awesome moment in any author's life. And for some of us, it hasn't happened yet, but coming along. It's something to look forward to. One last quick question. Obviously, you had an uphill struggle when you were trying to market a standalone. And you came up with some tactics that probably almost every tactic that you used would work just as well or better for a series book.
Yes.
Do you think there is any marketing thing that favors a standalone, or is it all, you know, going to do better with series?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I know that there are definitely some readers who will talk about how they would like to see more standalones, and they get a little tired of series because they want just for once to be able to read a book and the story's finished, and they're tired of cliffhangers and that sort of thing. But I think it's kind of difficult to know how to reach those specific readers. And yeah, I don't know that there's anything that was specific to this book as a standalone and I can do this thing that I couldn't do otherwise. I guess probably things like the awards are probably easier with standalone books because they tend to be a little hesitant if they're not seeing the full story. But I don't know if it's going to get nominated for any as a standalone. So.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a good point, though. All right, that's it. That's all I have. So I'll hand you off to Jeff for last a couple questions.
Okay, my question for you: how do you feel about authors who have more than one title in their series, making the first title perma-free? Do you think that might still be an effective use for them?
I've definitely seen people say that's worked very well for them, and it's something that I could see doing in sort of like a partial way, like doing it as you can buy it from Amazon or you can get it for free by signing up to my mailing list, like that kind of thing. From a lot of the people that I've seen talking about it, it sounds like possibly right now the better strategy is to do the 99-cent entry book, and then you can still do periodic free promos on it. Whereas if it's always free, then you don't really have anywhere to go from there. And then have that lead into the other books in the series. And I mean, 99 cents is still a really good deal. So, but yeah, I haven't been able to try that yet. Yes, the other thing with free is that you have to be wide with that book then. Right now I'm all of my books are in KU. So I'm a little intimidated by the idea of trying to get into all the other retailers and that kind of thing.
Okay, how much of a presence do you have on social media? You mentioned Twitter. Are there any other platforms that you frequently use?
I'm fairly active on Facebook right now. I use both my kind of theoretically personal profile. I've never had it be very personal. It's always been kind of, I will accept friend requests from whoever. And so I have a lot of people who are fellow authors who I've never met or who I assume are readers, or I don't know why they would be friending me otherwise. So I have a lot of people who just follow my general account, and I'll post like stuff there, book news and, you know, fun questions and stuff. And then I also have my author page, which is a little more book focused, and most of the posts there are different information, things about my books or my giveaways or whatever. Yeah, so there's that, and then there's Twitter, and then I am on Tumblr as well, and I actually like Tumblr quite a lot, but I haven't quite figured out the trick to doing original content there. I basically just go through my friends list and find all my stuff that I think is cool to reblog, and set up a queue of cool stuff that way, but it's not really my own material. It's just like, look at these neat things that I found.